I'm Jerry White. I wrote a book called The Worst Street in North London, Campbell Bunk, Islington Between the Wars, which was published in 1986. And from the late 1970s onwards, I talked to many people who grew up or lived in Campbell Bunk in the 1920s and 30s. In many ways, it looked like an ordinary, typical suburban North London street, but it was very special. It had this reputation as a place where thieves, prostitutes, and very rough people lived. It had a reputation too, which, I mean, not quite true, but people thought that the police would only walk down there in twos. It was a very rough neighborhood, so it didn't take kindly to strangers, and there were stories about strangers being beaten up in the street as well as policemen. And it had this reputation really from the 1870s onwards. And so by the time of the First World War, it was very well established as a notorious place where lots of people living in Campbell Bunk ended up in the magistrates' courts. They were charged and convicted of stealing, of prostitution, of assaults. It was a very violent place, I think, for children who were living in very poor families and so on. So in many ways, it was a most odd street in London. There weren't that many streets like it, none locally. It was by far and away the most notorious street for miles in North London. So from that point of view, it was a very peculiar place indeed. The first thing to note about it was that in general, the people who lived there were pretty poor. I mean, compared to most working class residents of Holloway in the First World War, the people of Campbell Bunk were at the poorer end. They tended to be working in low-skilled trades like coal heaving in the coal yards at Finsbury Park or King's Cross, street sweepers, at the very sort of low end of manual labor. But there was a very important subset of people in Campbell Bunk who weren't wage laborers at all. They were living on their wits. They were rag and bone men. They were street sellers of, groceries. They were market traders. They were really sort of to one side of the ordinary working class of Holloway and North London. And they were really, I suppose, penny capitalists, you could call them. It was a very independent streak within the people of Campbell Bunk. And it was that sort of, it had traditions of street sellers. So for instance, on a Sunday morning, the rag and bone men, the people who were totters, who would go around the streets asking for, bottles and rags and so on, would put the best of their clothing on the railings and sell it to the poor people in Campbell Bunk. That was, as it were, their first port of call in terms of a market for the goods they picked up in the streets of London by knocking door to door on householders and saying, have you got any spare clothing that you don't want, and would take it away. Much like we recycle clothing now. Well, the totters and street sellers of Campbell Bunk were, Holloway's recyclers in the First World War and before and after. No one quite knows why it had the nickname. One reason might be that the street had more common lodging houses than any other street in Islington for many years. They declined in number during the First World War, but some of those common lodging houses where people would go, mainly men, would go and pay twopence or threepence to spend the night there and then move on somewhere else. Those common lodging houses frequently had bunks in. So that was one, argument about how the street got its name. The other, which I think is probably a bit more convincing, is that it was known as a hiding place. It was where people could go, where a thief who was, avoiding arrest in the street would run up Campbell Bunk, many of the street doors were open, and disappear into any house, knowing that the police would find it difficult to find them. He could then, skip over the backyard walls of Campbell Bunk and come out of another house somewhere else. So it's that sort of hiding place. It's a place where people could hide away and be secure from the authorities. That I think was probably the main strand of how it came to get its name. The New Court Church came to Torrington Park in 1866. So it's pretty close to Campbell Bunk at that point. Within a few years, the church itself had identified that the particular needs of the poor population of Campbell Bunk, particularly as it were its spiritual and educational needs, required some intervention by Christian communities nearby. And so from 1875, there was what New Court called a home mission, where people were they actually had a room in the streets where a missionary went to hold Bible readings, and where women of New Court Church could teach needle skills to Campbell Bunk housewives, and provide some sort of outlet for them out of their own very cramped and crowded homes. Well, within a few years, I think by the 1880s, that had developed into the Lennox Road mission. At the top end of Campbell Road, facing the road, was a mission which was then there right through, I think, the life of Campbell Bunk, until the street was actually demolished in the mid-1950s. And that provided a real resource for the people of Campbell Road, men and girls in particular, but also housewives. It provided things like a savings club, so that women particularly could put in savings of threepence or sixpence a week and know that at Christmas time they could get the money out, a bit like a post office savings bank now. But they could secure some money from, perhaps their rapacious husbands who would have more happily spent the money down the pub. There were girls' clubs, there was a boys' club run, I think, around about the time of the First World War, but certainly after, by a man called Henry Speller, who was much loved by young boys in Campbell Road, and who organized things like boxing classes, some educational classes, and really got the opportunity for kids to have a bit of time away from their families. It operated a Sunday school and so on. So it was a real resource for the people of Campbell Bunk, particularly the youngsters, I think, and the women. Well, we do know that young men in Campbell Road flocked to the colours. There was, not everyone, the sort of independent street trading element was probably not keen, frankly, to go into uniform at any cost, until conscription forced them to in the early months of 1916. But others early on flocked to the colours, and indeed there was quite a toll of sacrifice of young men in Campbell Bunk. There was a street shrine or a memorial to the fallen of Campbell Bunk was opened in the street in 1917, and it had something like 30 names on it of men from Campbell Road. There are 100 houses in Campbell Road, probably 300 or 400 households, so quite a large number of men potentially could join the colours from it. But something like 30 men by that point had fallen in the trenches and elsewhere in the army, mainly, I think some in the Navy. And so Campbell Road's sacrifice was one of those things, it made a story in the local paper. It was that, despite its very rough reputation, the fact that its young men had gone in large numbers to the colours was honoured, as it were, by the people of Islington. Although in peacetime, they wouldn't touch Campbell Bunk or the Bunkites with a barge pole. It did, and there's a similar picture, I think, from the Daily Mirror, at a Coronation Street party in 1937, where that banner, or a new one saying "Poor but Loyal," is also strung across the street for the street party given to the children, who were sitting down having their tea. The politics of Campbell Bunk were hard to discern, really. I mean, maybe you'd think, well, it's a poor community, they're bound to be Labour. They're bound to be, as it were, ordinary London working class, and therefore Labour voters. It didn't work like that. Lots of people there were working class Tories. Some had a loose attachment to the Labour Party. Some, because of their very independent way of earning a living, were hostile to trade unions. Some were xenophobic, didn't like foreigners, in any way at all. But the thing which I think united them was patriotism. And so, of all the slogans, "Poor but Loyal," which was a slogan that you could find in other poor streets in London, other rough streets of a similar reputation, that slogan, "Poor but Loyal," was a sort of unifying slogan. It's a sort of pride in the fact that this was not by any means a well-off part of London. But the thing that they took most pride from was their loyalty, which in many ways, of course, was, perfectly demonstrated by the fact that so many Campbell Bunk men had joined up and had paid, the final sacrifice, as it were, for their service to king and country. So from that point of view, I think it was a unifying slogan that everyone in Campbell Bunk could, see the sense of. I know a little bit about Congregationalists in Brixton, and there, fundamentally, it's the clerk class and above. These are reasonably well educated. They've all been to at least elementary schools, sometimes higher schools. They're all sort of, as it were, members of the Edwardian lower middle class. They often work in the city or as shopmen, because being a shop assistant for a man in the West End was a highly respected, employment, required a high standard of dress and so on. They're all keen cyclists. So that it's that sort of, phenomenon. And many of them might well live locally. I suspect that some come from quite a way to actually go to the church. And I think the difference between the men from Campbell Road is that the connection between New Court Congregational Church and Campbell Road was through the mission. In the ordinary course of events, Campbell Road was not a devout community. I didn't talk to anyone for whom church going played any part in their lives at all. But I found lots of people who went to Lennox Road Mission and took advantage, if I can put it that way, of what was on offer there. And that was the connecting route, I think, between Campbell Road and the organ, in a way in which other people had they were part of the New Court congregation, the ordinary part of the congregation. And as we know, the clerk class signed up for military service hand over fist in 1914. Of all the tiers of classes in London, it was the lower middle class who were first to answer the call in such large numbers, and bore the brunt of the early battles of Battle of Lewes in 1915 and so on, meant that the London regiment was decimated. So that immediate core of volunteers, so many of them clerical workers and shop workers, had a very bad time at the outset. But it's clear too from the number of men from Campbell Road who died that some of those must have been volunteering at the very start of the war as well, because so many had died by 1917. I think it's highly unlikely, I'm afraid to say. But highly unlikely. The organ restoration project has been absolutely wonderful, and obviously it's a fantastic instrument. And it's so good that it's now going to be in use again, but the sort of details of its commemorative purpose, appear still to be a little bit unclear. And who exactly was commemorated and who wasn't. Clearly it's not just people who died, because some of your soldiers survived the war. And so exactly who was commemorated and why, is something still of a mystery, which maybe, you'll be able to sort out once, the researches carry on. The street was still, its lively old self, really, in the 1920s and 30s. I think it's, as far as it's very difficult to precisely to tell sort of patterns, but in the 1920s, you would say that it was still a very rough street. In the 1930s, the rough component was a bit diluted. A lot of people moved away. It was a very overcrowded street, and if people could find better accommodation, they often did. They moved out of the street, in other words, to avoid overcrowding. And my impression is that there was more of that movement away in the 1930s than in the 1920s. Even so, in an overcrowding survey carried out in Islington in 1936, it's still by far and away the most, it's a highly overcrowded street with 10 times the overcrowding that there was in Islington as a whole. In the war, there was very little bomb damage, and a lot of houses were empty because a lot of people left London, lots of empty accommodation throughout the city. And so that anyone who wanted to find accommodation outside of Campbell Road really could. So if they wanted to escape the very sort of slummy conditions there, outside loos, houses bashed about by multiple occupation for generations, usually damp, lots of bed bugs, that sort of thing, they could easily find accommodation elsewhere because so much was available nearby. And so by the 1940s and 50s, there were lots of empty houses in the streets. And in the early 1950s, about 1954, I think, Islington Council resolved to declare Campbell Road a slum and call it a slum clearance area. And the slum clearance area was approved by government, and the street was emptied and people were rehoused by the council. And then the street was demolished in about 1956, 57. And then, council estate was built in its stead, and all you can see of the street is the opening. The street was renamed in 1938 Wadcote Street. It had been Campbell Bunk and Campbell Road until then, but it was called 1938 from 1938 Wadcote Street. And you can still see the little bit of Wadcote Street off the Seven Sisters Road where the street began, but that's all you can see of Campbell Bunk now.